Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. Season 8 is all about the re-enchanting Inklings. How do we rebuild, renew, and restore culture? The Inklings give us a model. I want to ask for your help in two ways. You're probably watching this episode on X or on YouTube. Please find and follow us on both platforms. I tweet as at the Optimistic C3. And then if you're looking for the show on YouTube, just search for the Optimistic Curmudgeon. We want you to be able to find and follow our content and then be able to share that across your platforms. We want to be part of the conversation and help other people to see how life is truly good, true, and beautiful. And now, on to this week's episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon. We're in Season 8, The Re-Enchanting Inklings, and I'm especially grateful to welcome my friend, Dr. Landon Loftin, to the show. Landon holds a PhD from Faulkner University. He teaches in Gravitas, the global extension of the Stony Brook School. He is also co-authored with Max Leyf the book entitled What Barfield Thought, an introduction to the work of Owen Barfield. And I might be wrong about this, but I believe in the relatively small group of people who did their degrees at Faulkner University, I think Landon is the first one to have finished a book before he finished his dissertation, if I remember correctly. So Landon, welcome to the show. This is going to be fun.
Thanks for having me.
Am I right about that? Do you know anybody else who did that? I still think that's quite an accomplishment.
Yeah, I don't know. But I knew what I was going to study, or what I wanted to focus on from the moment I entered Faulkner. So I had a laser focus in the direction I wanted to go. So I was able to use that time pretty productively.
Nice. Well, that's always that's at least the way the advice was given to me, and it sounds like it was very helpful to you. Landon, before we get into Barfield, tell us a little bit of your story. How do you? I know you're constantly writing, but you're also a full-time teacher. How did you get there? How did you get into Barfield? Help us know you a little bit.
Yeah, I'll just tell a little bit of my story. So I'm pretty new to teaching. Actually, I'm still figuring it out. I guess that's what old teachers say too, is that they're still figuring it out. But it really feels like I'm still figuring it out. But I love it. I started teaching for Gravitas a couple years ago. But before that, I was a hospital chaplain. And before becoming a hospital chaplain, I lived and worked in Ghana in West Africa with my wife. And we helped some friends of ours start a home for previously trafficked girls. That home's still there. It runs in our absence. They don't need us. So we came back to the United States. But while we were there for a while. I had to cope with the long, hot West African afternoons. And I thought, well, if I'm going to be here, sitting in a puddle of my own sweat, I might as well work on a master's degree. So that's what I did. And I loved it through Houston Christian University. And when I wrote my thesis, it was on C.S. Lewis's understanding of the imagination and the implications that had for the way he went about doing Christian theology and apologetics. But when you research something like that, you soon realize that Lewis's views about the nature and the function of the imagination, they were formed through a series of arguments, famously what Lewis called the Great War in his autobiography, the Great War with Owen Barfield. This man, Owen Barfield. I didn't know much about him. I just heard his name because I've been reading Lewis since I was like 16. So I thought, well, I need to read Owen Barfield. So I picked up this book, Poetic Diction. I was told it's the one that had the most influence on Lewis and the other Inklings. And I read it, and at first it struck me as a bit strange. I couldn't quite figure out what he was up to. Parts of it are really dense and difficult. But I stuck with it, and as soon as I got my bearings, I realized I was totally enthralled. I loved it. I think it was Thoreau who said that every man dates a new era in his life from the reading of a book. And I'm sure that's not true for every man. It's certainly true for me. There've been a few distinct eras, and one of them was opened up by poetic diction. And so from that point on, I just thought I want to learn as much as I can about Barfield. I want to understand him well. I had thought about trying to do some intensive research on Lewis. And then I realized there's a lot of people doing intensive research on Lewis, and it's good. A lot of it's fresh. It's not, that well is nowhere near dry, but it's too overwhelming to me. And I thought, well, this will be really interesting. So I decided to study Barfield. That's why I enrolled at Faulkner in the PhD program, because I wanted to find a way to carry that study forward. and knew I would write a Barfield-related dissertation. And as I did that, as you know, it's a great book school. Sort of wanted to learn more about the great books. I thought, oh, I guess I'll have to teach the great books when I'm done with this program. So that's why I changed directions in my career, and that's why I'm where I'm at now. So it's been kind of took an odd route to get here, but I'm glad to be here.
I'm so glad you took that route. And it's I think most of us at the Faulkner program have a circuitous route, and most of the people I've met that I've enjoyed learning from at conferences, very few of them end up going just the straight undergrad, grad school, PhD, tenure track professorship route. They tend to have this more meandering journey, and then but the journey always culminates, and it equips them to be able to say what it is that they want to say. Could you tell us a little bit more about the Great War? I've read Surprised by Joy and need to reread it, but I don't remember exactly what that was. So run us through what the Great War was with Owen Barfield.
Sure. So what Lewis called the Great War, which of course was funny because it happened soon after both of them had finished actually serving in World War One. And to them, both of their attitudes toward that was like, well, that was just something we did for a while, but now we're back to the real business of life. All the Inklings, well, maybe I shouldn't say that. Lewis and Barfield were both very flippant about their experiences in the war, it seems to me. For Barfield, there's more justification because he was sort of riding a horse around Belgium, reading poetry for most of the war. Whereas I know Lewis, really did some fighting in the trenches. But they had this long series of arguments. They wrote these letters back and forth, but they're more than letters. They're like treatises with Latin names and a very complex web of allusions that they understood that not everybody else understands unless you really do some hard research. But what it was occasioned by was Barfield's adoption of anthroposophy, which is something we can briefly talk about. It's such an unusual word, anthroposophy. But that is the system of thought that is derived from the teachings of Rudolf Steiner, who was an Austrian polymath. Absolutely brilliant, absolutely bizarre man. Like, both the brilliance and the bizarreness cannot be overestimated. So, but Barfield, for a number of reasons, was really enthralled with Steiner's ideas, and Lewis was very turned off by them. Now, at this point, Lewis was still, I think he had left sort of the strict materialism behind him, but he was certainly not a traditional theist and certainly not a Christian. And so the Great War played an important role in bringing Lewis to a point where he could take those next steps into theism and then Christianity. But the crux of the debate, it was about a lot of things. The crux of it was about the nature of the imagination and whether and to what extent the imagination is, as some have put it, a truth-bearing faculty. And Lewis was very suspicious of that sort of claim, and Barfield believed it to be true. And the discourse between them is absolutely fascinating. It's hard to understand because they were writing to each other. The number of inside jokes and obscure allusions it's wild. But there's a really great book about it, Joy in the Poetic Imagination by Stephen Thorson. That's the best place to go to learn about it, apart from what's mentioned in Lewis's autobiography.
Oh, there's so much there. I'm going to resist the temptation just to ask you a bunch of follow-up questions about that. I recently went over to UNC Chapel Hill's library. They've got Lewis's copy of The Fairy Queen there. And I was going there as a potential future project of looking at Lewis's annotations to The Fairy Queen. And I was astounded. Now there are some notes that are just, Lewis is clearly like it's a handwritten marginal note, but he then footnotes in what I assume is the Oxford version of Turabian styling, but it's just like this is the right way to do a footnote. But it's just like his own marginal note. But then he had several notes that were like him going back and forth with his brother Warney about some obscure theological debate they were having. And you just have to infer from the marginal note what Warney must have said, but Lewis is clearly writing here. So I can only imagine how much fun it would be to go see all of those in jokes and their allusions, because they're two brilliant young men who are writing back and forth, and I assume they're kind of a little bit showing off their own brilliance in the way they communicate with each other.
Yeah, I think it's very clear that they enjoy the battle, they enjoy the fight, and they're enjoying. It's Have you ever read Boswell's Life of Johnson? He talks about
excerpts. No.
Yeah. He talks about Johnson's favorite thing to do is competitive talking, and I thought, I love that. I'm all about that. That's fun. But Lewis and Barfield were definitely competitive talkers. Everything they wrote back and forth there's like a little humorous dig here and some kind of insult that's well meant here, and it's really entertaining stuff in my view.
Oh, excellent. Also, that's already getting to some of the introductory stuff I was hoping to cover about Barfield. We know that Barfield was a very significant influence on Lewis. Of course, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is dedicated to Lucy Barfield, Lewis's goddaughter, who I assume is the daughter of Owen Barfield. And then, so they clearly are very close to each other. Could you help situate? Now, you mentioned that Barfield has views on the imagination. I know we're going to get into Barfield on language. Where does Barfield sit in kind of the general constellation of the Inklings? I don't even know quite how to describe that constellation. Yeah. Where would you put him in that group?
Yeah, so in the Inklings, contrary to the way it's sometimes characterized, it's a very loose association of people, and it morphed over time. And so it wasn't like one group of people always meeting together formally. You know all this, but maybe the listeners don't. And so Barfield was very, very involved close to the beginning, but then he moved to London and was only able to come on occasion to the meetings. And so some people have sort of discounted his importance to the group. I think that's a big mistake. And the reason why is because Barfield, he was the earliest, and if not the clearest, I would say maybe the most profound defender or exemplar of the ideals that would later come to characterize the group as a whole. And so very early on, long before any of the other Inklings were publishing, he was writing fairy tales like The Silver Trumpet. He was writing these books like Poetic Diction, which have, you see it already. You see this as a work of one of the Inklings that reflects or embodies that indefinable essence which bound all these people together around C.S. Lewis, the love of imagination and literature. And I don't know, it just has a particular, you just get a sense of it. Like this is a work of one of the Inklings. And he was publishing these books long before any of the other Inklings were doing any serious, academic or popular work. And I mean, I like the way that R.J. Riley put it. He wrote a good book called Romantic Religion. And he said that many of the romantic notions common to members of the Inklings, of the group, the Inklings, exist in their most basic and radical form in Barfield's work. I think that's a good assessment. So when Max Leyf and I assessed Barfield's place in the Inklings in our introduction to Barfield, we said Lewis was central to the group, but Barfield was foundational. So I think that's, as far as I can tell, I think that's the best way to think about it. His way of thinking, his work from a very early period, long before any group started meeting together and calling themselves the Inklings. It was a lot of foreshadowing of what would come from many of the other authors.
Well, that idea of foundational is really interesting. Because part of what I want to talk about today is history and English words. We'll get to in a second, but there was a section in there that I read. I thought, oh my goodness, this sounds like Tolkien's poem Mythopoeia. And Tolkien's got this great line about he sees no stars who has not seen them first, in a tent, elf woven and myth patterned, or myth patterned and elf woven. But it's the idea of like the mythic image in the story predates the word. Some sort of experience of the thing predates our term for it. Did Tolkien develop that kind of independently of Barfield? Did Barfield help Tolkien see that? Like, how do those guys relate when it comes to language?
Yeah. Okay. So Tolkien very clearly derived a lot of benefit from reading, in particular, Barfield's poetic diction. If there's evidence that he read Barfield's other books, I'm not aware of it. Well, obviously, he read Barfield's The Silver Trumpet, a fairy tale to his children, and according to Lewis, he scored a direct hit. So Tolkien liked Barfield's fairy tale, The Silver Trumpet. But as far as Barfield's more philological or philosophical works, I'm only aware of evidence that he read poetic diction, but according to Lewis, it was made a big impression on Tolkien. I think Lewis, I mean, some people might say Lewis was prone to exaggeration with these sorts of things. I'm not sure, how much credence to give that claim, but he reported to Barfield that that Barfield's idea of the ancient semantic unities, which is something he discusses in poetic diction, radically altered Tolkien's view of language itself. And that, according to Lewis, Tolkien said that he was constantly in lectures about to say things and then thinking of Barfield and thinking, oh, I can't say that anymore, that sort of thing. So I think that Barfield had a big influence on Tolkien, but it's hard to say in detail. And of course, establishing influence is always a little bit tricky if you don't have somebody coming out and saying, this person influenced me in this way. But there's other, bits of evidence too, which are interesting. Like in The Hobbit, Tolkien in a letter said, there's only one philological remark in all of The Hobbit, and nobody's going to get it unless they've read Barfield. So
Okay.
Tolkien obviously learned something from Barfield, took him seriously, and thought seriously about his work. Let's see. I want to find that remark in The Hobbit. It's the sentence he's referring to is when it says, "To say that Bilbo's breath was taken away is no description at all. There are no words left to express his staggerment, since men changed the language that they had learned of elves in the days when all the world was wonderful." That's what he's referring to. He's saying you wouldn't see this, you wouldn't get it if you haven't read Barfield.
Okay, wait. Okay, so I've only read one book from Barfield, so I don't know if I've read enough Barfield to get it. But here's at least my take. You have to tell me if I'm right or not.
Yeah.
I mean, I think what he's suggesting there is that in the days of the elves, when things were wonderful, there are certain words that are going to describe a wonderful experiences, but then they don't have words that are going to describe bad experiences or even mediocre experiences. But as human experiences shift, as we get from the first age into the second or third age, that the language is going to change as well to reflect human experiences. So there might be echoes of those wonderful days in the language, but that's no longer going to be the primary language that's used and the primary meanings understood. Is that somewhat close? Or
I think you've got part of it, but there's more to it than that.
Okay.
So Barfield thought that if you trace the history of any language back as far as we're able to trace it, and you look as far back as we have records of human language, what you'll see is a trajectory of change from a sort of fragmented, he uses the term idolatrous consciousness, where we see ourselves as subjects in a world full of objects. Whereas if you look back, read Homer's Iliad in the Greek, he says the language itself embodies a different kind of consciousness where there's no clear line to draw between subject and object. And he calls this state of consciousness participation. That's later in a later book after History and English Words. Mm-hmm. But since we're on History and English Words, let me read a quote, and I think this will give you a good sense of it. It says, as to the number of words which are indirectly descended from prehistoric religious feeling, it is not possible to count them. We can only say that the farther back language as a whole is traced, the more poetic and animated do its sources appear, until it seems at last to dissolve into a kind of mist of myth. the beneficence and malignance, what may be called the soul qualities of natural phenomena, such as clouds or plants or animals, make a more vivid impression at this time than their outer shapes and appearances. So I think what Tolkien has in mind is this idea that in what we could describe as like mythic consciousness, that which fundamentally characterized the mind of the kind of person or people responsible for bringing the Iliad and the Odyssey into being. And you can't get this out of a translation, Barfield would say. You have to understand how the very words embody concepts which are inexpressible in any modern language. Then we see that there was this sort of consciousness which was derived from a sort of elemental connection to the rest of the world, rather than like individual autonomous units of subjective consciousness in a world full of objects, which is how we experience the world today. Even if philosophically we're not like, materialists or, substance dualists or anything like that, we still experience the world because we've inherited sort of a form of consciousness with modern language. And I think that's what Tolkien has in mind.
Okay. All right, one of the things I think this is related to that. It might not be, but I think one of the things that fascinates me about Barfield, this is on page 17 in my edition. He says, these are some of the many ways in which words may be made to disgorge the past that is bottled up inside them. As coal and wine, when we kindle or drink them, yield up their bottled sunshine. I think that's such a fascinating image, the idea that the past is literally stored in the words that we use. And most of us are completely ignorant of that past. That doesn't change the fact that it's there. Just as we could have coal and wine that is unused. It might be wine that we've not opened the bottle yet, or coal that we've not thrown into the furnace. But if we ever use those in a certain way, we can unlock what's within those things. And it seems like Barfield has this sense of which deep study and strong etymological awareness of connections of words helps these words bring forth the past that's hidden in them.
Yes. Yeah. And can I read one more quote? This one's,
of course.
This one's a little lengthier, but it'll really, I think it's the best one to give everybody who watches or listens a sense of this book and a sense of how this book was the beginning of Barfield's whole career, in that between history and English words and poetic diction, those are like the twin pillars upon which everything else Barfield did rest. So in some ways, this book and poetic diction, they're less refined, less elaborate, less precise than a book like Saving the Appearances, which he wrote much later in life. But nevertheless, they're just, I mean, to me, they're astonishing. And he wrote these books in his 20s. He was like 26 when he wrote this book, which to me is just
amazing.
Yeah, I mean, that's astonishing to me. He not only that it's so erudite, but that it's he just knew what he was about from such a young age, and he continued following that thread for the rest of his life until the late 90s is when he died. So he outlived the other Inklings by the other core Inklings by a lot. But let me read this quote, because this is going to give a good sense of the book as a whole and of Barfield, really. It says, but until a few years ago, within the memory of men still living, very little use had been made of language itself, that is to say, of the historical forms and meanings of words, as interpreters, both of the past and of the workings of men's minds. It's only just begun to dawn on us that in our own language alone, not to speak of its many companions, the past history of humanity is spread out in an imperishable map, just as the history of the mineral earth lies embedded in the layers of its outer crust. But there is this difference between the record of the rocks and the secrets which are hidden in language. Whereas the former can only give us knowledge of outward dead things, such as forgotten seas, the bodily shapes of prehistoric animals and primitive men, language has preserved for us the inner living history of man's soul. It reveals the evolution of consciousness. So that's like a thesis for Barfield's whole body of work over the course of however many decades.
Well, no, I remember how you interpreted that at the Ciceronian Society last year. But for the sake of our listeners, what exactly does Barfield mean when he says the history of consciousness, and what sense of evolution does he have in view here?
Yeah, so I want to be clear up front. We're not talking about biological evolution or the philosophical debate about how conscious creatures with a first person perspective could have evolved out of through an immaterial process, material, not immaterial. And it has nothing to do with that. He's talking about the very fundamental character of the human mind, as it not only affecting not only what's believed about the world, but how the world is perceived. And so uh, for Barfield, he saw the history of consciousness as embodied in the historical changes and meanings and words, as showing us what he would describe as, and I'm sorry, there's no way to put this really succinctly, but
No, you're good. Keep going. This is great.
As a change from the human consciousness participating in the life of nature to becoming a self-conscious observer of nature. So the evolution of consciousness has to do with the rise of self-consciousness and the separation of our sense of subject and object. So this is not only theoretical for Barfield. He actually went through a major crisis where he deeply depressed for a long time, and even suggested at one point that he wasn't sure he wanted to wake up anymore, because he just felt like inside he was so burningly alive. He was a living subject, but outside of him was all just like dead objects moving in accordance with the fixed laws of physics. And he realized that perception, though common in the modern world and embodied, is a form of consciousness embodied in modern languages, has not always been shared by other people. And then he realized, wait, why should we assume that our consciousness is gives us the final say on the world? And he spent much of his life trying to show that he thinks actually we have a lot to learn from people who, in a very fundamental way, thought, felt, and perceived the world differently.
Man, that was a great passage to take us to, Landon. I want to go to an adjacent topic. You sent me an article last night about Barfield's work on the pro life cause, which I didn't know about. But it seems to me that these pieces must connect in some way. That, like, Barfield has such a high view of human consciousness and a high view of and I presume then the human person. And then he's focusing on this word abortion, and he sees something really awful happening in the idea of abortion. So walk us through kind of why that was such a big deal for Barfield, and then what he did in kind of a very active sense to try and work against the spread of abortion in, I assume, primarily in the UK. Would have been his context that he's looking at.
Yeah. So this is an aspect of his biography that I felt had been to some degree overlooked. I mean, it's mentioned in the one main biography of Barfield. I'm in the beginning stages of writing my own biography of him, so we'll see how that goes. It's kind of a daunting prospect, but I'm excited about it. But the Barfield was one of 15 founding members of the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children, which is, according to their website, is the oldest and largest pro-life campaigning organization in the world. So, I mean, that's a big deal. I think that he was one of 15, and he was a solicitor or an attorney, a lawyer, as we might say. That's what he did. It was his day job. Which is another remarkable thing about Barfield, is that he did a lot, considering he spent hours and hours every day working through the tedium of his law practice. But they brought him on. He wanted to be involved, and he could help them with some of his legal knowledge. And to him, it was really important because he saw the he saw the tendency of modern consciousness to objectify everything within its view as being the root cause of certain worrying moral trends. And one of those was abortion. And so, he often used abortion as a metaphor when he wanted to make a really graphic point. So I have some of these in front of me. So, like, of all the devices for dragooning the human spirit, he said, the least clumsy is to procure its abortion in the womb of language. And, there's a bunch of others like that. And then in his book, Night Operation, which it's a short fiction book, really bizarre book, and not really characteristic of Barfield in certain ways, but a lot of people really love it. It's not my favorite Barfield book, but there's a passage here at the beginning where he says, he talks about how in this sort of apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic world, his mother and her gynecologist didn't find any special reason for aborting him, and so he was born. He's always just kind of talking about it in this way. He portrays it as something that we should be have strong feelings about, but then he looks around him and he sees people using sort of dehumanizing language about unborn children, that it's a fetus and that's the end of it, and he says, well, that's because we don't see a human being as a unit of infinite dignity that's existence and value transcends birth and death. And if we did, we wouldn't even be having this debate. But here it is. Here's the quote. He says, if it becomes as much a matter of common sense, he's talking about in the future, as the converse is now, that an individual human being is a unit of dignity transcending birth and death and not a lump of galvanized meat, he says, then the practice of abortion will be no more. So, yeah, he wrote all about it. Maybe just to give a sense of it, if I can read a little bit from the last paragraph of that little essay,
Sure.
to give you a sense of how that's connected to his wider thought. So anyone interested in Barfield's thought will see immediately that his views on abortion are inextricably intertwined with his broader framework of thought. Though I'm not going to pursue it here. A worthwhile study connecting Barfield's specific conviction on this matter to his convictions about the nature of consciousness, its changing relation to the world, could be undertaken. And in fact, Barfield begins this work by suggesting that the root cause of the differences between the two publics in the debate on abortion, the root cause is a difference between the temporal and logical priority that they assign to to mind and world. So he thought mind precedes matter, and until we can see that more clearly, we're doomed to make all kinds of moral missteps.
Man, that is just not something I had in my imagination of the Inklings, and so I'm glad to know that Barfield was kind of connecting those dots and making those arguments. I mean, there seems to be such a strong connection between seeing the human person as this conscious being who exists both body and soul, and to some extent, I think Barfield struck me as really being somebody who is pushing back against Enlightenment rationality to some degree, but not in any way rejecting reason, but subordinating reason as another means of knowing. But there's also experiences that are also ways of knowing. And in this consciousness that is receiving past experiences through language, like that also seems significant for Barfield. And I'm just going to put my wandering cat on the floor. He really wants to be on the show, but he does not need to be on the show.
Yeah.
No. Well, Landon, I wonder if you could also help us with kind of situating Barfield inside the I'm not even quite sure how to frame the contrast I'm looking for, but something about the wider field of language study. I know there's a shift from philology to linguistics happening, once we get past World War II, post-structuralism is going to cast an enormous amount of doubt on the ability of language to carry meaning in a way that other people can understand it. By the time we get to the late 20th century, the big postmodern debates of I'm thinking of there's one famous moment where it seems to crystallize it. It's when Jacques Derrida and Hans Georg Gadamer were at the same conference, and they delivered papers against each other in a way. And but at least Gadamer explained why he disagreed with Derrida, and Derrida wrote a paper that had nothing to do with anything. And there seems so where in the midst of this over the 20th century, where does Barfield sit in conversation with others who are thinking about the meaning of language?
Yeah, against all those well-known philosophers of language in the century in which he wrote, Barfield was always, you could describe him as taking the anti-reductionistic tack. So to him, meaning was fundamental, and any philosophy of language that didn't make room for the full experience of, what it is that we experience when we come to know meaning in language is unacceptable. And so, but at first it was logical positivism and others. So let me back up. Barfield's later works demonstrate some deep and careful engagement with the schools of thought, some of the schools of thought that you're referring to. But when he first began writing, the so-called linguistic turn was still in its infancy, hadn't really gained momentum outside of small academic circles. But as the influence of certain schools of thought, for example, the linguistic analysts or the logical positivists grew, Barfield, he offered just these trenchant, devastating critiques of those, and yet he was totally ignored. I'm not aware of any evidence that he was ever taken seriously, at least in that stage of his career. And he really, the positivistic fever in Europe and America would later break, but it could have broken a lot sooner had they just given Barfield some due attention. But he was a little bit too unorthodox to ever be taken seriously in the academy, at least until late in life, when he did some scholarly work on Coleridge that was respectable by the standards of academics. And by respect, I mean it fit within the rules of the game that academics play. Not that his other works didn't meet a certain level of quality. It's just they weren't. It was too unorthodox for most academics. But later in life, he did get taken seriously, especially by literary scholars in the United States. And that was actually why he was invited to so many visiting professorships in the US. And there's a funny story here. He was once, I don't remember which university he was at, maybe Brandeis University. And he was being introduced before delivering a lecture to a room full of students. And one of the professors who was introducing him introduced him as like one of the founders and leaders in the field of hermeneutics. And Barfield was like, "What's hermeneutics?" I mean, he was proficient in, he was a philologist. Like, he knew that he understood what the word would mean, but he didn't know this was like an emerging field, because he was kind of his own thing. But the perception of many American academics was he was like on the forefront of a big movement, and to him, he's just like, oh, okay, whatever. It's called hermeneutics. Okay, that's fine.
Oh, that's funny. I didn't know that story, and he's certainly in good company with an awful lot of seminary students, and every student I've ever tried to teach that word to. It's I first encountered formal hermeneutics at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, and it's one of those few languages, or not languages, but it's one of those few disciplines I think could make a play to be sort of a master discipline, in the sense that the ability to interpret knowledge is pretty key. I mean, that transcends a lot of other disciplines. So I can certainly see, I I can see where History in English Words could fit as a hermeneutical text, because he's sort of asserting an epistemology and a view of the way meaning remains, and that when you're reading it, you have to be very intentional to read it in the time that it's spoken, but then also not commit the fallacy of assuming all meanings are equally present at all times, and so on.
And poetic diction, even more so, more direct. He offers a real hermeneutic, an epistemology of derived from the poetic experience.
Oh, you've sold me on the fact that my Barfield knowledge is not yet complete. I clearly need to go on and read poetic diction.
Yeah.
Well, Landon, before I toss out the next question, we have a nice live stream audience today. So just a quick thank you to everybody joining us live as we're recording. If you've got a question for Landon about Owen Barfield, please feel free to add that as a comment, and we'll take those at the end. But Landon, I want to go to kind of a general question from History in English Words. I would love to get your thoughts, particularly on what Barfield is doing with Greek words, Roman words, and then broadly Semitic terms. You read a line earlier about the language or the terms of religious fervor that kind of come to us through the Hebrew. In various places in History in English Words, Barfield talks about the Greeks really developing sort of the experience of interiority and the experience of the life of the mind, and then developing words for those. But then for Rome, it's more, he talks about kind of the skeleton of civilization is developed through their words. He had a great section about the fact that in no prior civilization did they have a vocabulary for the healthy exercise of authority. The Greeks have negative words like tyrants for the one wielding authority, but it's the Romans who come up with the magistrate, who is not necessarily a bad guy, and so on. But then we get his push to what he calls the Semitic religious zeal, particularly the Hebrews, but he also has some words for the Arabs, and Islam is also channeling some of that religious zeal. Walk us through your thoughts on those, and just kind of unpack a little bit more of what Barfield is doing with those three different civilizations that he's looking at.
Sure. Well, first of all, we have to remember what Barfield is doing, the big project in History in English Words. So we have to remember that according to him, and I think this is self-evidently true, the consciousness, the fundamental state of mind of a community, of a linguistic community, is embodied in their language. So the fundamental assumptions, the sorts of distinctions that are used commonly in thinking, that sort of thing, these are embodied, or the consciousness is in a way encoded in the language that's used. And the language is constantly adapting as consciousness changes. And of course, one of the ways in which consciousness changes is when it comes into contact with other cultures or other communities that have maybe a different form of consciousness, right? And that leaves marks on the language. So, when he looks back through the English language to the various cultures whose language has in some way shaped modern English, he sees, okay, for example, most of what we think about when we think in terms of legal, law, that all derives from the Romans. And so it's no surprise, of course, that there's you trace language back and you don't really find that prior to the Romans, at least insofar as it influences the English language. So legal terms tend to be derived from Latin, right? Okay, and then the Greek, same thing, that these sort of, mentioned the interiority, the philosophical consciousness, and then further back, the sort of mythical consciousness. And all these contributions that different cultures and linguistic communities have made to our consciousness have left marks on the language, which expresses the consciousness which is common to modern English speakers. So that's sort of the big picture. So as far as the Greeks go, it's not neat and tidy, because the Greek of Homer and the Greek of Aristotle not only linguistically are very different, but those are two different, cultural contexts, two different, stages in the development of Greek consciousness. And nevertheless, we can see certain things, ways in which the distinctive character of the Greek mind has left marks on the English language. The tendency toward abstraction, I think, and that one gets a little bit complicated because the more abstract a word is in English, the more it tends to take on a Latin form, and he talks about why that's the case. But nevertheless, there's a very concrete character to all ancient languages. The farther back we trace them, the more concrete they tend to be. And then they become more sort of abstract, diverse. We could even say fragmented as we get closer and closer to modern times. And the Greeks played a role in that. The Romans played a role in that. It, particularly for Barfield, he doesn't really develop this in History and English Words, but he thought that the role of the Hebrew people, especially in their hatred of idolatry, that played an important role in bringing about consciousness as we experience it today. So yeah, I don't know where to take that from there, but
no, I think those are helpful insights. I was does he expand on the Hebrew influence a bit more in poetic diction? Because I did think that was not thoroughly well addressed in History and English Words.
Yeah, Saving the Appearances would be the place to look for that. And I'm not sure what to make of all the claims he makes in that section of Saving the Appearances, personally. But there are some things that I think are important, because so the big picture, the trajectory of the evolution of human consciousness on Barfield's account is the sort of slow rise from mere consciousness to self-consciousness. And the Greeks, the Hebrews, the Romans, each in their own way have played some part in that, whether it's in making it possible for us to think abstractly about things, or in the way that we conceive of God and moral obligations and all these things. But there's these interesting remarks. You mentioned Greek, Hebrew, Roman, but also for Barfield, the big thing is Christian. So he thinks in the patristic era, a major change happened, and he's certainly not alone in thinking this. I think it was Carl Jung who said that the church fathers were the first psychologists. And what he said is he thought that somehow the life, death, and resurrection of Christ affected humanity such that there were new interior depths which we were suddenly conscious of within ourselves, that we have no evidence in the language or literature of pre-Christian cultures that there was any consciousness of. So I think that's what Carl Jung meant, and Barfield believes that very much too. And so that's why you get, somebody like St. Augustine, who just is fascinated with the interior world of his own being in a way that you cannot imagine in a very ancient culture, that sort of passionate, introspective perspective on the world. And so, add Christian to the list of.
And he certainly does. He does way more in this book than we can really hash out, because he goes on to. I mean, this book functions really as kind of almost a history of Western civilization with particular focus on language. We got the medieval Christendom, we got the French-English interactions, and the 1066, and then even getting all the way up through the Tudor days. But he brings it up to the end pretty close to his own present. I mean, he ends with the Romantics. I'll read just the last bit he does there. He ends with Wordsworth. And it's a lovely poem that I'm just gonna read for a second. Then I'll pose my last question. This is from Wordsworth's preface to The Recluse. Urania, I shall need thy guidance, or a greater muse, if such descend to earth or dwell in highest heaven. For I must tread on shadowy ground, must sink deep, and aloft ascending, breathe in worlds to which the heaven of heavens is but a veil. All strength, all terror, single or in bands, that ever was put forth in personal form, Jehovah, with his thunder, and the choir of shouting angels, and the imperial thrones, I pass them unalarmed. Not chaos, not the darkest pit of lowest Erebus, nor aught of blinder vacancy, scooped out by help of dreams. One breeds such fear and awe as fall upon us often when we look into our minds, into the mind of man, my haunt and the main region of my song. He closes this with two chapters that I just thought were a fascinating way to wrap all of this up. He looks at the development of a mechanistic consciousness, and a lot of the changes that develop out of the scientific revolution into the industrial revolution. But then he looks to the romantics as sort of these are the ones who are preserving the imagination, and it is the imagination that's going to provide some level of salvation from the mechanistic modernity that it seems to me he clearly has in view there with the mechanistic chapter. Landon, if this is always a dangerous question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. If Barfield were still alive today, and if he were revising history in English words, do you think he would update this with another chapter? Would he end it a different way, or still end it the exact same way that it ends?
Yeah, you're right that these sort of hypotheticals are usually dangerous. This one's not. I know exactly what Barfield would do. He would say that the Romantics were onto something, but that it's Rudolf Steiner and anthroposophy that they were grasping for what Rudolf Steiner found and the gift that he has to offer the world through his philosophy. So Barfield was fond of calling anthroposophy Romanticism come of age. And so he thought that Romanticism was like the beginning stages of the emergence of something that that Rudolf Steiner really brought forth in its fullness. So I am very confident that if he were writing it today, the final chapter would be about how all this stuff about the imagination and all these insights and the spirit of the Romantics reach their culmination in Rudolf Steiner.
Well, with that, I'm afraid you may need to give us all a quick primer on Rudolf Steiner, and I hope I'm saying it right, anthroposophy. What exactly was this movement?
Oh, man. It's a hard question because, I'm not an anthroposophist, though I went through stages with Rudolf Steiner that first I was like, this guy is weird. I have no idea what he's talking about, says this bizarre stuff. And then I realized, okay, I get it. I understand why people think he was an absolute genius. He was an absolute genius. There's no doubt about that, even if I'm not an anthroposophist. But the problem is, as an outsider, I look in at anthroposophy and I see that people within it often, at least in my limited experience, have passionate debates about how you should characterize anthroposophy and have very different interpretations. So I'm always hesitant to put a dog in that fight because, but anthroposophy is just the word for it's sort of esoteric Christian teachings that are derived from the extensive work of Rudolf Steiner. And if you had to characterize, I'm not going to characterize anthroposophy, but for Barfield, I think the most important part of it was that it was what he saw in it was a way of regaining what's been lost in the evolution of human consciousness without sacrificing what's been gained. So Barfield did not think that we should try to turn the clock backwards and enter back into a kind of consciousness that characterized a previous age, even though he thought that on the whole people were better off then, or maybe had a better view of the world, more conducive to human flourishing. And yet he saw that as, he used a word he would often say, participation or inspiration. And then he said, but we've evolved to the point where it's no longer inspiration, which is passive. It's imagination, which is active. And that's how we give meaning to the world. And it's not like a subjective, the world means whatever we want it to mean, but we play an active role in bringing it about such that we experience the world as meaningful through imagination. And that actually gets back to the debate that Lewis and Barfield had, the Great War, because it's about what role the imagination plays in the life of the mind. So, yeah, I mean, I'm certain that, that's the direction Barfield would go if he were to add a chapter to the book. And for anthroposophy, I'm not going to try to characterize it, but Steiner thought that it was really important that we recognize and take seriously the active role that we have to play in giving to the world that part of us which helps us to see it then as meaningful.
Well, it's an appropriate idea to bring in, especially for this season, because I'm hoping that each of these conversations contributes to helping listeners in season 8 be aware of the need to discover a right reenchantment of the world. And I think this is similar to what you're describing, but I draw that term. I first ran into that term primarily from Charles Taylor in his book, A Secular Age. I mean, he's, of course, drawing that forward. I'm blanking on. That's what I get for trying to be fancy and name drop. It's going to come to me. It's Science as a Vocation is the name of the essay. And Max Weber was the guy who coined the term disenchantment to describe modernity. I think there's been a sense for at least a century, if not 150 years at this point, that there is just some way in which modernity is profoundly cut off from the reality of being. And there are all kinds of different attempts to get back to that. And I think one of the things I love about the Inklings, and maybe this goes way back more to Barfield than I realized, is that I think they've got that itch to try and figure out, why is the world so meaningful? Why is life so important? Why is human life so significant in this world? And then that the answers that they derive seem to drive each of them to tell great stories. So it seems like Barfield is very much a crucial piece of that puzzle.
Yeah, and honestly, I'm not sure you can do any better with any of the Inklings in giving a historical account of the sense of meaninglessness that afflicts modern people, and the reason why that sense of meaninglessness is a lie, and that it's not how things have to be. Maybe I can leave everybody with a recommendation. If you want to get started in Barfield, there's an essay called The Rediscovery of Meaning, which very clear, accessible, short, and gives us sort of a bird's eye view of Barfield's account of why we are unable, seemingly, to perceive the world as imbued with meaning as ancient people so easily saw it. But again, Barfield's not content to say we should be like them. He's saying we have gained something. Self-consciousness is a good thing. With it comes, lots of good things like freedom. But, we want to try to recover what we've lost without losing what we've gained. And that's really what he was all about.
Well, Landon, thank you so much for the recommendation, for your scholarship, for your attempt to speak to anthroposophy. I ran into that in reading. Lewis went through a phase. It did not last long for him, but he went through a phase where he flirted with anthroposophy. He got really into Hinduism without ever leaving England, and it was just one of many things in the air in the early 20th century in the UK. It seems like. So I appreciate you taking a stab at trying to pin that down for us. Landon, just in case anybody's intrigued and wants to make sure that they can pre-order your biography of Owen Barfield someday, where can people find and follow your work online?
I don't really have an online hub. Anybody who's interested can join the Owen Barfield Facebook group. It's just a place for discussion of Barfield. If you want to have some people to run some ideas by, if you're trying to figure out what he's up to, it's a good place. Or you can just add me on Facebook and I'll post about it when there's something worth posting about.
Perfect. Yeah, I know I submitted a question. I'm pretty sure if you're the admin, you must have approved my question about how would Owen Barfield respond to Twitter memes.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
How do memes function like words as storehouses of the imagination, which is what Barfield called words. And it's actually, it's something worth considering.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you, listeners and viewers, for joining us here today on The Optimistic Curmudgeon. My guest has been Dr. Landon Loftin, author of What Barfield Thought, an introduction to the work of Owen Barfield. We'll have links to a lot of things we talked about in this episode in the show description, but definitely Landon's recommendation, The Rediscovery of Meaning. You've been listening to another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If so, please do find and follow us on X and on YouTube. On X, you can find me as @TheOptimisticC3, and on YouTube, just search for Optimistic Curmudgeon. We want to make sure that you have the ability to find and follow all of our content. And then if you're looking at the show description, you'll see links to any resources that were referenced in the show, as well as the sponsors for this episode. Please do check those out. We are very grateful for a variety of different institutions in helping to make this show possible. Until next time, seek the good, enjoy the true, and live the beautiful.